The purpose of this talk is not to give you a lot of final results and detailed measurements, but rather, the purpose of this talk is to stimulate your thinking about super efficient stoves. The problem with stoves as they currently exist is that gases have high viscosity and low thermal conductivity. When the hot gases strike the bottom of the pot, they form a boundary layer about 6 millimeters thick. Remember that number, 6 millimeters. Gases that start out outside the boundary layer pretty much stay outside the boundary layer and never transfer heat very well. Gases that are within the boundary layer move in uniform rows without very much mixing. They transfer some heat to the pot, but the ultimate final result is that only about maybe a small fraction, less than half of the heat is transferred to the pot. Usually the exit gases are not a whole lot cooler than they were when they first came into the system. So this first idea uses enhanced radiation because radiation can pass easily through the boundary layer. Here, a stainless steel screen is placed over top of the stove, which intercepts the hot gases and gets hot. The stainless steel screen gets hot and radiates heat very strongly to the bottom of the pot. The gases passing through this screen are less hot than they were at the start, but still hot enough that some heat will be transferred by convection. Therefore, you lose a little convection, but you gain a lot of radiation for a net gain overall. The remaining ideas all work by breaking up the thermal boundary layer by forcing hot gas to flow through a narrow restriction. How narrow is narrow? A lot less than the boundary layer thickness. That's how narrow. If the pot is part of that restriction, the heat transfer to the pot should be excellent. And then because you do have large restrictions, a small fan or blower will probably be needed. And I'll say more about that in a little bit. The second idea uses perforated metal, which is available in a wide range of sizes and dimensions. A ring of perforated metal is bonded to the bottom of the pot, either by welding or brazing. In reality, you'd probably use more like 3 rings, but I'm only going to show one here for clarity, and I acknowledge that these are not exactly 21st century graphics, but imagine that I'm standing at a chalkboard, perhaps covered with chalk dust, writing really, really fast. So the ring or rings of perforated metal is bonded to the bottom of the pot. The hot gases flow through the holes, the small holes in the perforated metal. The perforated metal gets very hot and conducts heat into the bottom of the pot. A vacuum system, about which I'll say more later, is used to force the gases to flow up through the stove, through the small holes in the perforated metal ring, into the outer shell where the gases are much cooler, and then into the vacuum system. Looking at the same thing in a bottom view, the hot gases come up and out of the stove here. They flow radially outward through the small holes in the perforated metal ring into the outer shell, at which point they're much cooler, and then they get sucked out into the vacuum system. There are a number of ways to produce a vacuum simply. One way is to use a small plastic blower, which costs only about $1 and consumes maybe 3 watts. To produce maybe 1 inch of water pressure, blow that through a jet injector, which creates maybe 1/4 of an inch of vacuum here, and that should be enough to get the air to flow through the small holes in the perforated metal ring. 1/4 of an inch of vacuum is a lot more than any natural draft stove can produce. The next idea is what I call the narrow gap idea, in which the hot gas from the stove is sucked into a shell and forced to flow through a narrow gap very close to the bottom of the pot. Since the thickness of this gap is much less than the thickness of the boundary layer, heat transfer from the gas to the pot should be excellent. Again, you would have a collection ring around the outside of the system and then a vacuum system to get the hot gas to flow. On the shell, you would probably have a series of protrusions to hold the gap at its proper dimension. The final and most complicated idea is what I call the impingement heat transfer idea. You have a corrugated metal shell with high, wide corrugations that are very close to the bottom of the pot, and then some lower, narrow corrugations down here. In the high, wide corrugations, you have a series of small holes or a slot, so hot gas is forced to flow through that series of holes, getting excellent impingement heat transfer in this region, and then pretty good heat transfer in this region because of that narrow gap under the bottom of the pot, and then poor heat transfer in this region, but by then the gases have given up most of their heat. They drop down into these lower corrugations where they can flow easily either away from the viewer or toward the viewer, depending on which is the shortest path. Dimension H needs to be fairly large, maybe like 30 to 50 millimeters, but you should get excellent heat transfer over this entire region of the pot, and thus excellent heat transfer overall. You may be able to combine these ideas by putting a stainless steel mesh into the narrow gap idea, getting very good convective heat transfer because of the narrow gap, and then very good radiative heat transfer due to the stainless steel mesh. Similarly, you could use the stainless steel mesh in conjunction with the corrugated metal idea, again to get radiation from the stainless steel mesh, and then the excellent convective heat transfer within that narrow gap. In addition to saving fuel, there are practical benefits to getting higher efficiency. We've done a lot of surveys with what users really want from their stoves, and I'm willing to bet that not once has anyone ever said that their stove is just too powerful. They will say, however, that their stove perhaps burns their delicate foods such as rice. So I believe any of these ideas can be used to get both more power and more uniform heat transfer for less burning of the, not burning of the fuel, burning of the food, less burning of the food. Since you need less fire overall to get the job done, you could possibly get by with less tending of the fire and then possibly lower cost overall. What I mean by that is that our best method for getting very high efficiency currently is to use what's called a sunken pot stove, which has a lot of structure to it. With these ideas, there's a lot less structure, so I believe that you could get higher efficiency and lower stove cost at the same time. Some limitations on these ideas are that they would typically work well for clean burning stoves only, and except for the radiation idea, flat bottom pots only. And then of course there's the extra complexity that you would need with the blower and the power to run it, which I don't think is particularly all that bad or all that much, but it is an extra step of complexity that's required. Some opportunities here are these ideas would work best when the users pay cashola for the fuel and thus have a strong incentive to save fuel through a higher efficiency stove. That of course leads immediately to the institutional stoves, which fit that requirement perfectly. I don't know that much about carbon financing, but I expect that there would be synergies here between carbon financing and super efficient stoves. And then finally, a number of people, including the people at Cal Poly and me and Larry Winiarski, have thought in terms of stored solar thermal energy used for cooking. That could perhaps be combined with these ideas using either hot air or hot oil as the heat transfer fluid. So finally, I hope that I have stimulated your thinking with this talk and that you will do like me and spend every waking minute thinking about super efficient stoves.